Steel screamed softly as ballast tanks flooded. December 1983. Commander Alexei Morozov stood rigid in the control room while his Akula-class submarine slid upward toward periscope depth in the frigid gray waters east of Hokkaido, fingers gripping the rail as the hull settled at its ordered depth. This moment was the proof of everything. Proof that the Pacific bastion routes were still blind. Proof that Soviet engineers hadn't lied. Proof that his boat was a ghost. The transit through the Kuril monitoring lines had been flawless. Not a single alarm, not a whisper on passive sonar, only the low, comforting heartbeat of his own reactor and the endless ocean beyond the steel. Morozov allowed himself a breath. This submarine was new, terrifyingly expensive, wrapped in a revolutionary anechoic skin designed to drink sound itself. Each rubber tile a promise from Moscow that American ears were obsolete. He believed it. He had to. Then the promise cracked. Sonar reported first, hesitant, confused, a voice that did not want to be right. Captain, surface contact, bearing west, distance 15 kilometers. Morozov felt the temperature in the room drop. He leaned over the display. One contact, slow. No active emissions, no acoustic profile that fit any destroyer, cruiser, or patrol ship he knew by heart. Classification, civilian maybe, large. She's not moving much. The room filled with unease, the kind sailors recognize instantly, the kind that crawls up the spine. Doctrine whispered dive, run, vanish. But Doctrine assumed detection, and Morozov had not been detected. No ping, no maneuvering, just a ship sitting there waiting. He held course. Minutes stretched into hours. The ship followed. Always the same distance. Every turn mirrored. Every speed change matched. 6 hours of silent humiliation as Morozov realized something was wrong in a way training never prepared him for. This wasn't pursuit. It was certainty. When he finally ordered a deep dive and pushed the boat hard into the darkness, the contact stayed above, unhurried, tracking a submarine it should not have been able to hear at all. Morozov surfaced long after nightfall and transmitted a compressed burst toward Vladivostok, hands shaking despite himself, reporting an unarmed American auxiliary. No weapons, no aircraft, yet tracking with impossible precision. The reply would take a day. By then, analysts would already be staring at a map marked with red pins, because Morozov's boat was not the first, not the fifth, but one of many. Same silent follower. Same cold confidence. Same nameless ship marked USNS, crew dressed like civilians. No threat visible, no escape possible. Soviet intelligence would later call it the Phantom Vessel. But that night, Morozov felt something worse than fear. He felt certainty collapsing. The certainty that the ocean still hid secrets. The certainty that submarines ruled the deep. And as his boat slipped back into the black water, one thought followed him down, heavy and inescapable, because if this was only the beginning, then whatever came next would not need to fight the Soviet fleet at all. Ice shattered and rolled away from the sail as the submarine forced its way upward, metal groaning like a wounded animal. Early 1985. Captain First Rank Mikhail Sazonov wiped condensation from his eyes and stared at the chart table, already knowing the truth before anyone dared to say it out loud. They were no longer being hunted. They were being observed. Perfectly, relentlessly. The Americans had abandoned the old war entirely. No depth charges, no dramatic chases, no sonar pings echoing like gunfire. They had chosen something colder, quieter, and far more lethal. Listening. It became undeniable when naval intelligence finally laid the report side by side. 16 submarines, 3 fleets. Hundreds of thousands of square kilometers, and the same outcome every time. Escape routes predicted months earlier were already compromised. Evasion maneuvers taught for decades no longer worked. Silence itself had betrayed them. Sazonov had felt it under the polar ice north of Novaya Zemlya. His missile boat gliding through waters Soviet textbooks swore were acoustically dead, layered with thermoclines meant to fracture sound and swallow noise whole. 6 hours after departure, American patrol aircraft were already overhead, buoys splashing into the sea with casual precision, not searching, not guessing, just confirming. Sazonov drove his boat deeper, slower, quieter than doctrine allowed, every order stripping away another illusion of safety. The aircraft adjusted. When he surfaced 3 days later, exhausted men staring at him for answers he did not have. An American frigate was waiting at the exact edge of visual range, engines idling like it had all the time in the world. Moscow reacted the way frightened systems always do, with arrests instead of answers. Officers vanished into interrogation rooms. Cipher clerks were accused, engineers were blamed, theories multiplied and collapsed just as fast. Satellites couldn't see steel through kilometers of water. Radio silence ruled out interception. No human network could move this fast. And then a quiet analyst, Captain Third Rank Sergei Belov, wrote what no one wanted to read. In a sealed technical memorandum dated April 1985, he suggested that American passive detection had crossed a line science itself said was impossible, that Soviet submarines should assume constant exposure the moment they left coastal waters. His conclusion was dismissed as panic dressed up as math. Yet buried in Belov's appendix was a detail too consistent to ignore, even if everyone tried. The same ship, always the same ship. Slow, unarmed, civilian markings, appearing impossibly in different oceans within weeks. Barents Sea, Sea of Japan, Eastern Pacific approaches. Never closer than 15 kilometers, never emitting sound. Naval reconnaissance photos showed her name painted plainly on the hull, USNS Vigilant, an oceanographic research vessel on paper, crewed by civilians and a handful of uniformed specialists, built quietly in an American shipyard far from headlines. What Belov could not yet prove, what would only surface years later through open-source American journals and leaked conference papers, was that Vigilant was not a hunter at all. She was a node, a nerve center, one listening ear among many, connected to seabed sensors, drifting arrays, and processing algorithms born not from naval tradition but from something far older and more dangerous to empires. The science of pattern recognition. The Americans weren't detecting submarines directly. They were detecting the ocean reacting to them. Pressure changes, microcurrents. Cavitation whispers so faint Soviet engineers had never bothered to measure them. Vigilant didn't chase steel. She listened to the sea itself and let the sea tell her where the steel was. And as Belov reread his own report late one night, realizing the implications too vast to stop, he understood the final truth tying every encounter together. The Soviet fleet hadn't been outclassed in battle. It had been rendered visible. The winch screamed as the trawler's crew dragged something unnatural from the gray water, rubber skin glistening, heavy, wrong. Spring, 1985. Somewhere south of the Commander Islands, sailors stared at 70 meters of black cable floating like a severed nerve. And in that moment, the ocean gave up a secret it had guarded too well. Within 2 days, the object was sealed, flown under guard, and delivered to a sterile laboratory outside Leningrad, where senior engineer Viktor Semyonov locked the doors and began cutting. What he found dismantled a generation of certainty. Inside the housing were not crude sensors, but an orchestra. Hundreds of hydrophones aligned with obsessive precision, ceramics tuned to hear everything from the slow groan of tectonic plates to the shriek of cavitation, each channel feeding processors designed not to amplify sound, but to subtract the ocean from it. Semyonov measured tolerances and felt his confidence drain away. This was not incremental progress. This was a different philosophy. A towed array like this did not need to hunt. It simply needed time, and the sea would do the rest. His calculations were merciless. Mobile listening posts could now reach across entire basins. The Americans had taken the static walls of underwater microphones and taught them to move. When Semyonov wrote his conclusion, he did not soften it. Soviet acoustic stealth no longer existed. The tragedy was that Soviet submarines had done exactly what they were told. They were quieter than ever. Decibels had fallen, vibrations dampened. Engineers celebrated charts that showed noise sinking beneath ambient ocean levels at tactical ranges. But the Americans had not tried to beat the ocean. They had learned to understand it. Where Soviet factories worked in millimeters, American plants worked in hundredths. Where Soviet analysts averaged noise, Americans isolated it. Pumps sang, gears whispered. Propellers betrayed themselves with bubbles collapsing like microscopic explosions. None of it mattered before. All of it mattered now. When Semyonov's team fed real patrol recordings into models based on the recovered array, the room went silent. Targets appeared instantly. Distances that doctrine called impossible lit up with clarity. New boats, old boats, expensive boats, titanium dreams, all equally visible. Years of investment evaporated in a single simulation. The report went straight to the top, sealed so tightly it barely existed, read by a handful of men who understood what it meant and said nothing to anyone else. The Navy's invisible shield was gone, and panic would only make it worse. Somewhere far from Moscow, an American auxiliary ship continued to tow its cable through empty water, crew bored, coffee cooling, computers quietly turning the Pacific into a map of breathing machines. And the final insult, the detail that would haunt Soviet planners long after the Cold War ended, was how cheaply it had been done. Years earlier, in Washington, faced with empty budgets and impossible timelines, American naval planners had abandoned the idea of walls and fortresses beneath the sea. Instead, they chose mobility, mathematics, and patience. They didn't need to hear everything everywhere. They only needed to hear enough, long enough, for the ocean itself to tell them the rest. The meeting room smelled of stale coffee and cold metal when the idea finally broke through. November 1979. Papers spread like casualties across the table. Dr. Alan Prescott leaned forward and said what no one expected to hear. Stop anchoring ears to the seabed. Put them on ships and let them roam. The room went quiet. Not because the idea was new, but because its implications were terrifyingly obvious. Warships had tried this before and failed. They were too loud, too busy, too expensive, burning fuel and attention while drowning in their own noise. Prescott's vision stripped all that away. No weapons, no speed, no heroics. Just endurance and silence. A merchant hull moving slowly through international waters, staffed by civilians, costing pennies compared to a destroyer, listening without ever announcing itself. When the proposal reached Admiral Charles Harlan's desk, he didn't see a budget fix. He saw the end of the old naval game. Mobile ears meant uncertainty for the enemy. Fixed arrays could be mapped, plotted, avoided. A ship could drift today where doctrine said tomorrow was safe. Approval came quietly, with one clause written in a hand that understood history. Integrate the new deep array system, classified beyond program names, beyond budgets, beyond most admirals. The shipyard received requirements that read like science fiction. Not fast, not strong, not armed, but quieter than anything afloat. Designers fought vibration like an enemy, isolating engines on air cushions, reshaping propellers blade by blade, redesigning auxiliary systems most engineers never thought about. Even footsteps were measured. Even doors were dampened. When the hull finally slid into the water, she looked harmless, almost clumsy, a working ship with oversized winches and no teeth. That illusion was deliberate. Her true cost trailed behind her, kilometers of cable packed with sensors tuned to hear not explosions, but patterns. Moscow would see a research ship. What they would not see was the math. The real breakthrough had been born years earlier in a laboratory far from the sea, where physicist Daniel Kramer was studying how to extract faint signals from cosmic background noise. His equations weren't meant for oceans or war, but they solved a similar problem: how to find meaning buried under overwhelming randomness. Applied underwater, those algorithms didn't listen for loud sounds. They listened for consistency. A pump cycling every few seconds, a gear meshing at a fixed ratio, cavitation bubbles collapsing in statistically repeatable ways. The ocean was chaos. Machines were not. By the time the listening ship entered her first patrol zone in early 1985, the system no longer needed proximity. It needed patience. As she crept through the Sea of Okhotsk at 5 knots, her array sinking into deep water behind her like a thought extending outward, Soviet submarines were already present, confident, silent, invisible by every rule they trusted. Hours passed, then days. Slowly, lines appeared on American screens, not contacts, but probabilities tightening into certainty. Somewhere below, a missile submarine adjusted speed, believing itself alone. The ship did nothing. No maneuver, no transmission, just listening, letting the ocean speak. And with that, a truth settled in that no admiral could ever reverse. The age of hiding in the deep had ended not with a battle, but with a calculation, and the men who still believed in invisibility were already being followed, from the moment they left port, by a ship that looked like it had no reason to be there at all. The screen didn't flash red or sound an alarm. It simply breathed, a thin green line steady against a field of noise. And that was how history changed, quietly, without ceremony. Harrington stood behind the operators, coffee untouched, watching civilians do something admirals had dreamed about for 40 years. The contact wasn't exciting. That was the most unsettling part. No chase, no tension, just confirmation. The Delta moved exactly as the algorithms predicted. Every course change anticipated seconds before it happened. Its machinery singing the same tired songs Soviet engineers had been unable to silence. As hours passed, more lines appeared. Another submarine farther north. Then one exiting port. Then a third adjusting speed beneath a thermal layer Moscow believed was opaque. By the end of the first patrol day, Impeccable wasn't discovering targets, she was curating them. Back in San Diego, analysts watched tracks extend across digital charts like pencil marks on glass, overlapping patrol zones, revealing patterns no human planner could see. Boats weren't just detectable, they were predictable. When the Delta altered course at 0342, the system flagged it before the turn completed, correlating pressure shifts, shaft load changes, and transient harmonics into a future position estimate that proved accurate within 2 kilometers. Harrington felt a chill that had nothing to do with the North Pacific. Somewhere under the waves, a Soviet captain believed he was invisible, maneuvering freely inside what doctrine called a sanctuary, while above him, a ship that looked like a floating warehouse was writing down every move he made. Over the next days, the picture sharpened. Patrol routes overlapped. Bastions weren't random. They were habits. Launch boxes weren't hidden. They were routine. Impeccable never closed distance, never threatened, never acknowledged what she knew. She simply listened and passed the truth ashore. In Moscow, weeks later, officers would argue over why American forces always seemed to arrive early, why evasion drills failed, why secrecy felt thinner every month. They would blame spies, satellites, betrayal. None of them would imagine a merchant captain with no weapons, 5 knots of speed, and a cable trailing silently behind him had already solved the puzzle. The Cold War had always been framed as a contest of missiles and courage, but in the Sea of Okhotsk, it revealed its real nature. It was a contest of data, and on that first patrol, as more contacts stacked neatly on the screen, one realization became unavoidable. The Americans didn't need to destroy the Soviet submarine fleet. They had already removed its greatest weapon, uncertainty. The line never wavered, and that was the most chilling part. The submarine changed depth, slowed, paused, rose again, and the array followed like a shadow with memory. Chen watched the numbers settle into place, pressure shifts bending frequencies just enough to reveal depth, machinery load, intent. By sunrise, she knew that boat better than its own captain did. She knew when he hesitated. She knew when he rehearsed silence. She knew the exact moment he stopped and waited in the dark, convinced the ocean had swallowed him whole. He followed doctrine perfectly. stayed far beyond the mythical detection boundary Soviet manuals treated as gospel, never imagining that the boundary itself had vanished years ago. Days turned into weeks, and Impeccable became something more than a ship. She became a ledger. Every hull that entered those waters was written down, measured, remembered. Old boats, new boats, boats so fresh their signatures still carried the irregularities of unfinished machinery. Each one added depth to the picture, turning guesses into certainty. Analysts ashore no longer asked where a submarine might be. They asked which one. When a missile boat slipped from its pier in spring and pointed its bow toward open water, the system followed calmly, hour by hour, kilometer by kilometer, across an ocean that no longer hid anything at all. By the end of that year, the listening ships had multiplied, spreading quietly across choke points and transit corridors, never blocking, never threatening, only collecting. Routes hardened into habits. Habits became vulnerabilities. A fleet that believed in stealth revealed its routines without ever knowing it was confessing. In Moscow, confidence remained intact, sustained by silence and tradition. In American databases, that confidence had already been dissected, indexed, and filed. The paradox reached its peak when recognition arrived. Medals without stories, citations without explanations. Civilian sailors standing at attention while admirals spoke in carefully empty phrases. Harrington accepted them with the same calm professionalism he brought to every patrol, aware only that his crew had done something important they were not allowed to understand. Chen felt it differently. She felt it in the repetition, in the way familiar signatures resurfaced months later. Unchanged, predictable, still trusting in invisibility. She knew some of the names now, not of men, but of machines, and that knowledge carried weight. By the time the decade closed, the truth had settled in quietly, like the sound of a distant engine finally resolved out of noise. The Cold War had not been decided by missiles in silos or submarines beneath the ice. It had been decided by listening, patiently, relentlessly, until secrecy itself gave up. And somewhere deep below the surface, steel still moved with confidence through water that had learned how to remember it.